Okay, I've rolled out several slabs of clay. One of the things I like to do when I'm rolling my textures in is I'll set it on a piece of canvas so that I can move it easily. One of the things I didn't show before was that when you lift a slab, you're going to lift it from the top edge and you're going to support it, especially when it's fresh clay, when it's wet clay. Once it's leather hard, it's not as critical, but you always want to support your clay. This canvas texture is in here. So if I want to remove that, I can. If I like that texture, I can leave it in there. There's several tools you can do. A rubber rib, which you can get at Phoenix Ceramics. We don't have those in our kits. The rubber rib will smooth these out. You can kind of hopefully see that in the camera. Just using my hand and lightly brushing across the surface with a very light grip will do the same thing. It removes that texture. You can see one little wrinkle here in the corner. I'm not too worried about that. Now, if I want to just highlight the texture that I'm putting in, I will take the time to really smooth these out. Now, I'm going to show you several different techniques for getting texture. So we'll do short clips and I'll show you each of those different types of texture. Then I'll show you how to build the piece in several different ways. One of the things a lot of people like to do is take a doily and put that into the piece. Make sure it's clean, make sure it doesn't have a bunch of extra bits of clay in it, and you'll just lay that down. Now, the more meticulous you are with how you lay out this doily and the light pressure that I'm giving it, very light pressure, you can't really tell, but I want it to kind of almost stick to the surface to start. I also don't want it to bunch up, so as I roll, I'm going to do a little bit of light pressure across the surface to start, and then I'm going to slowly increase pressure going back and forth across this until I see that this texture has embedded in the clay and the clay has filled to the top surface of this so that I'm getting even pressure and even texture all the way across. Now, you saw me last week in last week's video use those spacers on either side, and I could really roll and not think about it because I knew it was going to only embed to the side, to that point. If I go too far with this and I push that clay too far in and shove this too far down in, it'll start to overlap and I won't get as clean of a texture. So here's a nice heavy texture, consistent but somewhat irregular, so you get more of that hand feel. It doesn't feel machine made. So that's one technique, and I'll go ahead and show a few more. I'll show you guys this real quick because this is a texture slab that I made. You saw in some of my work I used a puzzle texture. I can explain how I made this if anybody's interested. But with something like this, you'll have the entire texture on plaster, and you generally want a slightly thicker slab. You won't want to go all the way down to 1/4 of an inch. And that's because this will embed at least 1/8 of an inch down into the texture. And I'll go ahead and show that real quick. With this, you start to see that texture on the top surface. I like to set it on the first roll, but it's pushing the clay forward. And so it will distort. At this point, you can add canvas to the top surface to lock it in, or you can continue by a very gentle forward and back. And you start to see, if you look close, and I don't know if you can see that in the video, but I think you can, there's a slight discoloration is all you're seeing. Well, those darker spots are actually where the canvas texture still exists, and that's because it's pressing the clay down in, and it's unable to remove that canvas texture because it's being forced down in. Now you just saw that lift, and that's okay, but if I try to lay that back down, I'm done for. It's not going to read right. And I'm going to lay that down so you can see the ghosting image that will frequently happen. If you're really careful, you can kind of fit it back into place, but I can always cut that off. Now, one of the things you'll be tempted to do is pull this off immediately. But you will be surprised with how many rolled edges you get on this sharp texture. So what I would say is let it sit for maybe a minute, 60 seconds, 2 minutes, and that plaster will absorb some of the moisture and give it a little bit more stiffness, and you'll have a more successful pull of that texture. Okay, it's been about 60 seconds. It's about the minimum you'd want to do. You don't want to leave it on too long because it will get too stiff, because that plaster really is dry and it's sucking the moisture out. So I'm going to go ahead and lift. Again, supporting my clay underneath. And then I'll go ahead and set this on edge and flip it over gently. And now you can see that texture has transferred to my surface. I'll go ahead and set that aside. Be careful when you put that hand underneath to support, because you are affecting your texture. All right, so here's another technique I really like. You could take paper. This is just a cardstock or a Bristol board. This is Illustrator board. You can get this from Palace Arts, any number of places. It's a lot thicker. It's maybe in the 1/16 of an inch range. And then this is just very thin, like maybe like 22, 24 gauge if we're talking metal. This is just cardstock paper. You don't want to do this with printer paper. It's just not quite enough. And this is laser cut. So you can cut this with an X-Acto. If you want to learn about the lasers we have here in the Makerspace and Fab Lab, you'll need to take my 95A class. But I can just set those on and carefully roll these in. Now, some people like to put them on the back side and roll the slab down in, kind of like I just did with the puzzle texture. Let's see if I can get all three of these in here. You don't want to go right to the edge with these, because the clay will change shape right at the edge. And you'll see that these two are the same thickness, and then this one is much thicker. And then I'll just roll those in carefully. And because these are smaller pieces, they kind of want to lift at first. I'm going to roll this big, thicker one, get it really kind of set, and then I'll roll these thinner guys. Trying to add equal pressure all the way across. And I want to really make sure that I'm getting this down, embedded in, and flush to the surface of the clay, so that everything is even and flat. And then what I'll do is I'll take, again, this is the type of thing where if you leave these thin ones too long, they'll suck up the moisture, which is good for your clay, but then it can make the paper so thin that you can't get it out. And this can be the trickiest part. I generally like to find a kind of open area and peel it up with my needle tool. Very, very subtle texture. And I can fix that little needle mark. Or you can go to the edge. I generally find the edge is harder to fix if I mess it up. There's that texture. And then this Illustrator board, much harder to cut with the X-Acto knife, but it's going to give you a much more pronounced, less subtle texture. And you see how delicately I'm pulling that off. You want to be real delicate with it. You can also see that it's got a much larger contrast here because of how deep it went. I had a little bit more pressure on the beginning and the end of my roller. I'm also doubling up every time I roll. I've got pressure in those spots longer at the ends. So I did not quite get as much texture here on these edges. When that wraps, it will actually work with the wrap because it'll wrap around. It'll kind of almost feel like it's stretched a little bit. Okay, here we are at our stamps texture. Again, you can use any combination of these you want. I wanted you guys to see how to make these stamps. And that way, when you want to use that technique, you can. You can utilize these stamps however you want. You can use one stamp directly in the middle of something. You can do a row of them. Sometimes less is more. Think about the texture, right? So the canvas texture, that is a texture. Even though it's very subtle and it's part of a process, it's a texture. Smooth is a texture. It's kind of the lack of texture, but it is considered a texture. And think about the negative space as you're laying these out. With a lot of these textures so far, it's been an entire sheet of texture, whereas with these stamps, you can choose to do a stamp every couple of inches and repeat that stamp regularly. You can measure that out. You can do it freehand like I've done here. These two are roughly the same. That one's a little bit closer. Maybe you want that. Maybe it doesn't matter when it wraps. You can also use the stamp to give an overall field of texture. And I don't know where these are gonna overlap, right? So I can texture the entire slab. I know I'm gonna cut that little bit off right there because it's not uniform, but I don't necessarily know where that's gonna fall right now. So again, you can use it as a repetitious form. I'm also gonna cut this off at the bottom. Then I could also come in with this other stamp and really press it in. Now, you just, in doing that, you just created thin and thick spots, right? So that pressed through. So that is something to keep in mind. You don't want to cut all the way through. Again, same thing. I can use this over and over and over and create a texture. I can also create a texture by repetition with just a regular tool, right? Maybe I like this texture. This is very similar. I'm overlapping two textures. This is similar to anybody that's done jewelry. This is a lot like the hammer texture technique. Switch to the other side, the knife edge, and I get a much thinner, longer line. And I'm just playing with texture to give interest to this flat plane. But remember, the negative space in between these textures can be as important as the textures themselves. And you can come in and smooth them out or change them as you go, but this really requires a lot of patience, but it can be very meditative depending on how you work, what you like to do. I'm just holding this very lightly and kind of just letting the weight of it sink in. If I hold it hard, I'm gonna get deeper, but that might not be what I want. So you'll come up with something here. I can just tap, 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 tap with my finger. I can use my whole wrist, and you'll get different depths based on that. But if I want a consistent texture, I want to do it the same all the way through. And this alone can give you a really interesting texture. Some textures, and you just won't know until you finish with glaze. Some textures work well with the glaze, some don't. Some work really good with certain glazes and not so great with other glazes. So this is something that you'll find over time.